After a Texas House representative issued something called the Krause List of 800 books to be removed from school libraries, librarians across the state found themselves at the center of what has become a large-scale coordinated conservative movement against freedom of information. With unique access to a new movement in the making, the librarians traverses small towns in the USA with riveting interviews and a trove of archival material to reveal the story of a country's heroic librarians. The film is called The Librarians, and we're joined today by the director, Kim A. Snyder. Kim, welcome to Cinemaphile.
Thanks so much for having me.
How did you become aware of this? Was this something that you read about? Where did this Krause list and the movement to begin this systematic banning of books in our libraries, where did that come from?
Well, in the fall of 21, I did become aware. I read a piece on the Krause list had just been issued this, and of course the word list always has a certain significance, but it was in fact these over 800 books that had been singled out on a list that school libraries in districts across Texas should scour their shelves and look to remove. And I learned about a small group of librarians in Texas calling themselves the Freedom Fighters with an FREAD, freedom, who were speaking out about it and organizing, mostly organizing other librarians. And they began to hear from librarians not only across Texas, but across the nation. And it was so many of them that they were hearing from. So I got in touch with them when I read about them. It was just a really strong documentarian instinct that this would be an important story, and went immediately to meet them in Texas. And really, we began as many of my films has as collaborators,
Yeah.
building trust and working together to lift up their voices and this story.
I mean, let's get right to the heart of this, which, in my opinion, is an attempt to erase history, to restrict the kind of information that we should all have access. It should be common information for all of us as American citizens. But this is and correct me if I'm wrong, but this at the heart of this. This is to restrict and to essentially manage the kind of information about ourselves, about our history. And this is in many cases around the world in our history of the world has been a precursor to a very different kind of society than we live in now. Is that
I
fair?
agree. Yes, I agree. I couldn't have said that better.
So let's go back to how, in your travels, how you came across people like Amanda Jones and others.
Yes, well, as I said, I started with these a small group of librarians in Texas, Carolyn Foote and Becky Calzada and Nancy Jo Lambert, and it started with a trust building that this was a story that needed to be told, and I understood right off the bat that there was incredible uncertainty, fear, and sensitivity around protecting their well-being. So we talked a lot about how we would approach seeing if and who wanted to speak about this. And, I learned that the librarians, have an incredibly strong network and solidarity, and not unlike law enforcement or different sectors of society. And they connect. They began to reach out and tell others, hey, there's this documentary crew, and we trust them, and do you want to share? And of course, some of those, it started in Texas, and the main thing was we quickly decided that this needed not to stay as a myopic story in Texas.
The film doesn't go into a deep dive of the
But
history of our library system, but it is fundamental. This is one of the crown jewels of American society is our library system. And the people that are attracted to be a part of it seem to feel very deeply about that history and about that commitment.
absolutely. I mean, many librarians have master's training and they study and learn. And one of their main commitments is to defending against censorship. So this is something, early on, I asked myself, what are the stakes for these librarians, as a storyteller? I came up with this idea that there were kind of three major stakes for them. One was upholding these tenets of First Amendment rights, freedom of expression, that so much underlie our essence
Yeah.
as Americans and are fundamentally not at all a partisan issue, because it's interesting that some of my librarians will say they have been registered Republicans, and that this is so not a partisan issue because Amanda was just with me in London and told people, look, I was brought up in a deeply Republican Christian household and town, and the two things that I was taught were to protect First Amendment rights and to love thy neighbor. And these are the values that I fiercely have fought to defend, and I was attacked for that by the same people who brought me up to fight for those things. That's one of the things that I saw them just fiercely protecting. And the other thing was marginalized kids and knowing firsthand that these books literally save lives. So they stand up for the principles as patriots in our society. They stand up for the kids who know that, as Martha says, when they go after the books, they're really going after those kids, and that I cannot abide. And then the third thing is they stand up for the books, beautiful literature, Toni Morrison, things that are treasures on our shelves. They fight for each and every one of these books as if they are souls.
You know, as someone who in my younger days was a voracious reader, you get through a book and it's an experience. It's like meeting another person, the author. You feel there's such a connection. You spend time with a book, you think about what you were reading at the time and you reflect on it later. There's a deep connection on so many different levels, and particularly in the books that you're describing that are on this list that have to do with our outlook on politics, our outlook on our history, and our outlook on our sexuality. And those are the things that they seem to be hell-bent to control. I can't imagine a more welcoming group than librarians. I mean, every time I have ever stepped foot in a library, it's an enveloping experience because you walk in, there are books everywhere. The people who are there are thrilled to be there. They're thrilled that you're there. It's just the whole environment of it is to essentially enrich you as a person.
Yeah, I know, Mike, it's interesting because what you said about this deep connection, I've been thinking a lot about the nerve that this seems to be striking with audiences from, all across the globe. And I think there's also something nostalgic about what, when you're a child, the first time that you're introduced to stories that you can choose, it's sometimes the first time you associate with a sense of agency and choice because you're too young to be able to go out in the physical world. But through books, you can start to travel, you can start to explore, and you get to choose what you're interested in and what might make you feel less alone or what kind of characters you gravitate toward. And I think that's what that deep nostalgia for many of us is it's a beautiful connection that's almost primal to a sense of choice and freedom, if that makes sense.
I'll go even a little bit deeper, and that is when you learn how to read, when you're a kid and you're being taught how to read and you master that particular skill, that is deeply embedded in your progression as a person. You are you there's this like, whether you realize it or not, you're growing up. And then to find people who you read, I mean, I can think of my foundational books that I'm as we're having our conversation that really impacted my life and the way I looked at life. So I just think, and then the fact that somebody is going to tell me who I can and cannot read, what I can know and not know, is, yeah, you're right. It's really foundational to people.
No, that's why I took so much thought and care about using visual means by way of these archival clips to remind us of that purity and that innocence when those little boys in that movie are exactly as you said, they're entering the library for the first time, they're seeing books, and they're trying to figure out how to read. There's such a sense of awe and joy for them.
Yeah.
That's what I try to do as a storyteller, is use visual metaphor to conjure that up.
You walk into a library and it's walking into another world. You don't know what the world has for, awaits you, and it's your decision to make as to what you choose to read. Yeah, there's so much here, and it's no accident that the things that as I described, that they're trying to restrict our history, which is hard enough. I'm just a personal observation. It is difficult enough to get the American people to have even a glancing idea of our history other than the Fourth of July speeches that we hear. We need to know our history. And for some reason, this a lot of people in this country just refuse to understand what our actual history is. Doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means we need to know what our history is. And we just seem adverse in many people just seem to not want to know. And that there's just so much here. There's so much about a film like The Librarians for anyone watching it to understand just how important what your film is about is to our ability to function as a society.
I agree. I did a bit of a deep dive into McCarthyism because, of course, you think of that more recent time in U.S. history and what it was that dialed it back. And I learned that part of what dialed it back or kept us from, going over the edge a bit with that was that he went after things that became a little bit too sacrosanct, like the military in
Hmm.
society. And I hope that in this kind of flooding the zone, overwhelmed space that a lot of people feel themselves in, that the symbolism of the librarian, as you say, I mean, these are like firefighters.
Yeah.
These are public servants who are there to be curators of knowledge, to go after them. That's why it was so important for me to weave this story and the spine of it about singularly about the siege on our librarians rather than just book banning at large. So that as a symbol, worldwide, really, they become unexpected heroes on the front lines of fighting to preserve our democracy, but they represent something so much more symbolic because we know, as you say, it's really not about just the books and the school libraries. It's now one of the things I like about where the that was very deliberately in terms of narrative arc is that our anonymous librarian who narrates a lot of it,
Hmm.
when she says, I don't know what's going to happen next, but now I know, but I know our story is still being written, but now it's everyone's stories. So when I first met them 4 years ago, they said, we're like the canaries in the coal mine. And boy, were they right, because 4 years later, this idea of it being everyone's story is that it's not school libraries alone. It is public libraries. It is museums. It is late night television. It is the freedom of expression in all realms, all sectors of our society. That's why I think what you're saying, that it's just so much bigger than arbitrating certain books on certain library shelves in the heartland.
Just want to remind our listeners we're speaking with Kim A. Snyder. She is the director of a fantastic new documentary film called The Librarians. And I believe we'll get to when it's going to be screening here in Los Angeles and moving around the country. October 3rd, Friday, October.
October 3rd, it releases in New York City, and then in LA, it rolls out on at the Lemley. It starts at the Lemley on October, hang on one second,
I've
9th.
got it October 9th and 10th in Los Angeles at the Lemley, of course, the fantastic Lemley theater chain. In just the last couple minutes, I also, it's hard not to notice that most of the librarians are women.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but think that there's another sort of shade to all of the things that are going into trying to restrict and constrict libraries and books. Is just when you see it's overwhelmingly, and my experience has been the same. You walk into a library and it's almost always mostly women, if not always. Do you think that plays into this at all, or is it just something, a self-selecting group? Or how do you think that plays out in this?
The librarians in my film will definitively say that misogyny plays into this, and they will say that the profession, as you note, is predominantly female. There are men, but it is predominantly female. They will say that it's hard for them to cite a librarian who's been attacked who's male. Absolutely, and they're often in a school where it's easy to scapegoat because there's one of them. There's a
Yeah,
lot of teachers. There's like one librarian. It's
yeah,
a woman. Can't tell you how many times I thought about, the Salem witch hunt or,
yeah,
where there's this just horrendous attack on one singular person who happens to be female. And I have to say the other thing is that as a human being, as a woman, it's particularly offensive to me that some of the books that been attacked have sexual assault in them and are being pulled under the guise of obscenity or pornography. Books like Beloved, like Toni Morrison's Beloved, that are books that are, yes, challenging for young readers, and that's the other thing is that the librarians will say there has always been parental rights. There's never been a problem with parents being able to challenge certain books, but there was a protocol and a process that has been brazenly defied in so many of these places. Their books being summarily removed without any due process. So it was the scope and the scale in the fall of 21 that the experience was like a pandemic, like a shocking wave that they had never seen or felt. And it's not like it's the first time we've heard about book banning in this country, but this was at a whole new level. So yes, I mean the idea that they're able under in certain places state penal code to be able to say that these books they're removing them under claiming that they're pornography or obscenity when you see in the movie one of the librarians who refused to the history of the KKK. She
yeah,
says how is that pornographic, how to be an anti-racist, and as I said, books that have maybe a paragraph that depicts a challenging scene of sexual assault that was important to understand about the times these characters were living through is offensive to all. It should be offensive to all people. And as one of my librarians said on stage last week, if you read a rape scene and consider that pornographic, then I have to question you
yeah,
and
yeah.
where you're coming from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's obvious, and there's something I like to say. I don't know how true it is, but we do see a reference to a billionaire who has been funding some of these efforts, and I like to say that money doesn't sleep, and that's the problem. That when you introduce someone with those kind of resources into something like this, lots of things that happen are not organic, but because there's just a whole nother level of momentum to and the pressure being applied that wouldn't have happened before. And I just think, yeah, because money doesn't sleep, there is something we have to be equally as relentless in our defense. What this film is about.
Well, exactly. And hopefully, I mean, the film, you use the word movement. The film is developing into a movement in its own right. And we're using the film. What's heartening, despite all of the very alarming things in the film, what's heartening is that the film is hitting a nerve and is having incredible demand in art house cinemas throughout the country and also has transcended borders. So we opened theatrically in London and Edinburgh and Dublin and in the UK last week. And the response is very, these messages are not lost. In fact, after our Librarian of Congress was fired, the day after we have had outreach from the German National Library, who've invited us to bring it to Germany because they said there are hundreds of librarians standing in solidarity in Germany who know all too well what the danger that this can foretell. So we see, the idea of taking this film and encouraging less polarization, encouraging civic dialogue and engagement in hyper-local ways across the country through art house cinemas and the hundreds and hundreds of libraries and campuses. that have reached out to ask to show this in settings where there's more of a town hall. We need to take this into to safe spaces where it's not the scripted vitriol that we've been seeing in these school board environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you remember maybe the first one or two books that you read that had that kind of impact on you that you to this day think of them as, part of your DNA?
I was really drawn to Ray Bradbury. I was a real Ray Bradbury. I couldn't get enough of his short stories, even before I was aware of you know Fahrenheit. That even wasn't even one of them. And there was an outsiderness, just something that drew me in about his tales. As a very little child, I think I was drawn to female protagonists, that could be whimsical, like Harriet the Spy. And then later, I remember being very affected by Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut, which of course was banned. And, I think the fantasy of time travel and the freedom of what literature could journey you through, all of those things are very memorable to me. And, of course, some of them are books that have been banned.
Yeah. Oh my God. I was going to say that's my Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions. I used to read a lot of newspapers. I read newspapers and magazines voraciously. And I didn't read a lot of books when I was growing up, but then when I did, that's it, Slaughterhouse-Five
Mm.
and Breakfast of Champions. I love Vonnegut. And yeah, wow.
And I also, we in the film took very great care to find quotes rather than arbitrating the books, that relitigate books that
Yeah.
some of the extremists are challenging. We wanted to also lift up some of the wonderful lines of literature. All of those books have been banned at some point that we
Yeah.
chose to put in the film. And one of my favorites that also had enormous impact was Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. So I think the quote that we pull in the film that says tolerance becomes a crime when applied to evil is
Yes.
something that I think is extremely timely in terms of the moment we're sitting in history. I think we all have to take our cues from these courageous librarians and the other people in small town America that we meet who are flanking them, and we have to have the courage to not be silent. And when we see restrictions and censorship over our freedom of expression, we have to stand up collectively and say something. And I'm hoping the film inspires that.
Well, amen to that. What a fantastic enterprise the Librarians is. A terrific watch, and we get to meet so many wonderful people. We get to meet some very compromised families in the process who are going through a lot, and hopefully they will work through all of those things that we see that they're going through in the film, and just so much more. Again, the film is The Librarians, and honored to have with us today the director, Kim A. Snyder. Kim, thank you so very much for your time and for your work.
Thank you so much for having me back.